diamonds, I know that you are bold. You robbed my poor pockets, took my silver and my gold. I've got them blues and my heart looks blue. Once I had a mama, and she was short and wide. But she got up one morning, that fool laid down and died. I got the blues, and my heart looked blue.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
9 months after Franklin Delano Roosevelt reassured the nation, Nellie Hamp had a lot to be afraid of. She had a job, but how secure could she be? She was a lowly stenographer for Morley Brothers, a Saginaw company in the business of selling industrial hardware and supplies during the Great Depression. Business could not have been good. Unemployment in the United States was 25%. Michigan's was almost double that. Car production was a quarter of what it had been. Breadlines snaked around blocks. Who knew if FDR's New Deal would merely be more of the same? Christmas 1933 must have been particularly hard for Nellie. Only 4 days earlier, the courts finalized her divorce from her husband of 3 years. The cause? Extreme cruelty. Her son Rod just turned 2. Her alcoholic mother had been living with them since her second husband died in 1929. The little family was on its own and solely dependent on Nellie. How did it come to this? Why? Over the next 4 parts, we'll tell the stories of her forebears reaching far back in time. These stories are fun on their own, some funny, some sad. There's a lot of history. It remains to be seen whether they provide any answers. Nellie's father was named Napoleon. Her mother's maiden name was Petit. In Saginaw, she was surrounded by former lumberjacks, so we all assumed that she was French-Canadian. Nope. Indeed, it's a bit unsettling that Nellie's story goes back to 16th century England and Henry VIII. As every elementary school student knows, Henry had two obsessions, a male heir and pretty girls. The drama surrounding Henry's twin pursuits set the stage for 150 years of religious fighting in England. In some cases, our ancestors helped drive that history. More often, they were pushed by it, eventually to America. Henry wasn't supposed to be King of England, his older brother Arthur was, and their father had arranged for Arthur's marriage to the Spanish Catherine of Aragon. Arthur died soon after the wedding, and Catherine eventually married Henry. Over the next 15 years, only one child, Mary, survived past infancy. By the time Catherine was 40, she was incapable of having any more children. No male heir. Meanwhile, Henry, who was a womanizer with a series of affairs in his past, had fallen in love with Anne Boleyn. He wanted her desperately, but Anne had bigger goals. No fling without the bling. Marrying Anne would solve all of Henry's problems, with just the sticky matter of his existing marriage to Catherine in the way. Henry put together a legal and diplomatic team to lobby Europe and the Pope for a divorce. Now, it's hard to see why they thought they were going to have any success with Pope Clement VII. Their argument for an annulment, more accurately Henry's argument, that the marriage to Catherine was illegitimate, hinged on a couple verses in Leviticus. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy brother's wife, it is thy brother's nakedness. And if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless. Childless must have rattled around Henry's brain. There is no chance for a male heir with Catherine. Now, you're not much of a biblical scholar if you can't argue both sides of a difficult question. Catherine's defenders had their own biblical passages. If brethren dwell together, and one of them die, and have no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry without unto a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in unto her, and take her to him to wife, and perform the duty of an husband's brother unto her. Dueling verses aside, the previous Pope Julius II had granted a specific dispensation to Henry's marriage to Catherine. In the eyes of the Catholic Church, that ended the question. Of course, when they lit against the King of England, politics means nothing's final. But politics is a two-edged sword. After the disastrous War of the League of Cognac, Pope Clement VII fell under the thumb of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Charles V was Catherine's nephew. After a number of years of diplomacy and legal wrangling going nowhere, one of Henry's team, Stephen Gardiner, was visiting a Cambridge colleague and sat for dinner with the children's tutor, Thomas Cranmer. Table talk turned to the king's great matter, and Cranmer advised to forget all that legal mumbo-jumbo. Vatican law could be bent in any direction. Instead, Cranmer suggested that the team should lobby Europe's great university theologians and turn them to the king's side. Soon, Cranmer was giving the same advice to Henry, and he was on the legal team, and importantly, Team Boleyn. I bring this up for three reasons. First, the team's survey, known as the Collectinae Assati Copiosa, is the intellectual defense of Henry's ultimate assertion of royal supremacy and hence the break with Rome. As documents go, it's a big deal, and Cranmer helped write it. Second, it's hilarious that it's Gardiner that brings Cranmer into the fold. Those two will become bitter archenemies. Third, and most importantly, this is where political history and the family intersect. Thomas Cranmer isn't directly in the family tree, but he is an uncle, albeit with a number of greats in front of him. His brother Edmund is Nellie's 10th great-grandfather. For 3 years, Thomas Cranmer worked on the continent for the king's annulment, traveling to Basel and Nuremberg and making lifelong contacts with Lutheran thinkers. By 1532, he was fully in the reformist camp. Despite being a priest, he married Marguerite, the niece of an important Lutheran theologian. So that's a thing. The next year, Henry and Anne secretly married. As the newly installed Archbishop of Canterbury, Cranmer held a phony hearing where he concluded the marriage to Catherine against the law of God, thereby also making Mary ineligible for the English throne. He validated Henry and Anne's marriage and crowned Anne queen. Elizabeth was born in September, with Cranmer as one of her godfathers. All very tidy. What goes around came around for Anne. After miscarrying a son, her standing with Henry was shaky, especially after he turned his eyes towards the lady in Anne's court, Jane Seymour. Even more dangerously, Anne had picked a fight with Henry's powerful minister and vicegerent, Thomas Cromwell, over the proceeds from confiscated church land. Anne wanted money from the land to help the poor. Cromwell had other plans. Cromwell organized trumped-up charges of adultery, incest, and treason, and she was taken to the Tower of London. Archbishop Cranmer wrote to Henry, the gentlest of protests, in defense of Anne. We're not talking profiles and courage here, but it's a great deal more than anyone else did to stick their necks out. Anne's own father served on the court that heard the cases of her supposed lovers, and there's no record of him making a peep. Cranmer heard Anne's last confession and was the only one to publicly mourn her beheading by an expert French swordsman. Henry married Jane, and she dutifully gave him his only son, Edward. Once again, Cranmer was godfather, but Jane died soon after birth. Henry then agreed to go through with a politically motivated marriage to the homely Anne of Cleves. Cranmer had not supported the marriage, fearing for Henry's happiness. Smart. Not so smart was the vicegerent Thomas Cromwell, who had pushed for the marriage to go forward for political reasons. The timing of Cromwell's matchmaking disaster could not have been worse, as he was also involved in a tangled fight with conservative lords. Cromwell lost. His execution was literally butchered, as it took the axeman extra swings to finish the job. Anne of Cleves sensibly agreed to step aside, and their marriage was quickly annulled. Henry then married Catherine Howard. It fell to Cranmer to break the news to Henry that his fifth wife was cheating on him. Cranmer recreated seventh grade by slipping Henry a note at the All Saints' Day Mass. Cranmer eventually got Catherine to confess the lurid details. First her paramours, and then she and her aide were sent to their deaths. Even today, her ghost is said to haunt Hampton Court. Her specter rushes through its great hall, shrieking, pleading with Henry to spare her life, as she did on the day of her arrest. Reformation prospects rose and fell with Henry's whims. At the start, Cranmer and the evangelical cause were ascendant, as the first order of business was to formally establish royal supremacy over the church. Henry, Cromwell, and Cranmer dealt with those allied with the Pope in that most English way. Catholic Saints Sir Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher were beheaded. Cranmer was at More's last interrogation and is depicted in the play A Man for All Seasons as presiding over More's death. Throughout Henry's reign, Cranmer fought to establish a more Protestant Church of England, especially against his arch-nemesis Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester. They battled over doctrinal matters such as the number of true sacraments, the treatment of saints and images, and even more trivial things such as priestly vestments. One of the more personal issues for Cranmer was clerical celibacy, and in 1539, at a time when conservatives were on top, he was forced to send his family away to the continent. Given the unstable political environment, some of these doctrinaire battles were a matter of life and death. The most dangerous to Cranmer was the so-called Prebendaries plot, where clerics and monks at Canterbury Cathedral and conservatives led by Stephen Gardiner tried to overthrow Cranmer, accusing him of heresy. As was typical, Cranmer was oblivious to the political intrigue, and at its climax, Cranmer met with Henry, who said, Ah, my chaplain, I have news for you. I know who is the greatest heretic in Kent. At which time he pulled out the summary of accusations against Cranmer. Imagine Cranmer's state of mind. He had seen this movie before, and it never ended well. Henry insisted an investigation must be mounted. Cranmer protested. Henry then laughed and told Cranmer to appoint himself in charge of the inquiry. Unlike Cranmer, Henry had a well-developed understanding of palace politics. Stephen Gardiner was smart enough to avoid a paper trail. His nephew Germain Gardiner, however, was way too sloppy. There was plenty enough evidence that led to his execution. On Henry's deathbed, Cranmer enjoyed a small victory for Protestants. Instead of administering last rites like a Catholic would, Cranmer simply held Henry's hand and asked Henry through some small gesture whether he trusted the Lord. As Fox recounts in his Acts and Monuments, "Then the king, holding him with his hand, did wring his hand in his as hard as he could." After Henry's death, Cranmer grew a beard, ostensibly in mourning, but also as a signal of a full break with Rome. From Henry's death past the English Civil War, the development of the English Church and the fortunes of our ancestors hinged on who was next in line for the English throne. Up first was Henry's only son, Edward VI, the boy king. At his ascension, he was too young to rule. The evangelical Edward Seymour was appointed Lord Protector, and under that protection, Cranmer busied himself with filling in the details of the new English Church. He issued the 42 Articles in 1552, which summarized Anglican doctrine. Later on, these would be edited down to the 39 Articles that survive today. Cranmer published his Doctrine of the Sacrament of the Body and Blood of Christ, which outlined his views on doctrinal matters and was generally a polemic against the Catholic Church. He issued 2 versions of the Book of Common Prayer, which still forms the basis of Anglican and Episcopal worship today. In it, Cranmer rewrote the wedding vows, where the bride promises to love, cherish, and obey. Modern couples have since crossed out obey, but I think we can all agree that Cranmer's formulation is a major improvement. Previously, brides had promised to be bonner and buxom in bed and at the board. It was particularly unhelpful to the Protestant cause when Edward VI contracted tuberculosis and died at age 16. In line with Edward's wishes and described in his Law of Succession, the throne passed to Lady Jane Grey. Here, Cranmer and Protestant leaders blew it. They did not have the foresight to immediately secure the Catholic Mary, the daughter of Henry and Catherine of Aragon. She raised an army in East Anglia, marched into London, and established herself as Queen of England. Lady Grey and her husband Lord Dudley, Thomas Cranmer, and 2 other clerics, Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, were taken to the Tower. Grey and Dudley were dispatched in February 1554. Cranmer, Ridley, and Latimer were tried the next year, and the latter 2 were burned at the stake. Over the next year, Cranmer was held at Oxford in fairly comfortable conditions, but endless questioning and badgering took its toll. By early 1556, Cranmer cracked, signing the first of his recantations of his Protestant beliefs. He started attending Catholic-style masses. He became unstable, renouncing his capitulation, and then swinging back to recantations 5 more times. Despite canon law that says a person rejecting his heresy should be spared the penalty of death, Mary demanded Cranmer's execution. And can we really blame her? Cranmer helped create English Protestantism. Mary was a devout Catholic. It was Cranmer who granted the divorce between Henry and her mother. She would no longer be the princess. Cranmer had declared her parents' marriage illegitimate. That made Mary a bastard. She probably took that one personally. The last straw was Cranmer's support of Lady Grey to the throne. After Mary signed the writ of his burning, Cranmer's collapse was complete. With a poetic sense of symmetry, the authorities gave him to read Thomas More's Dialogue of Comfort Against Tribulation. the book Moore wrote in the Tower as he awaited his own execution. At the ceremony at the church on Cranmer's last day, the first sermon defended the sentence on the grounds that the execution of 3 other Protestant leaders didn't quite even things up with Bishop Fisher's death, leaving Cranmer's demise to balance the grisly accounts. Cranmer then rose to speak, asking for the spectators to pray for God's forgiveness of his sins, but adding, "Yet one thing grieveth my conscience more than all the rest, whereof God willing I intend to speak more hereafter." His sermon proceeded conventionally, the authorities following along the prepared text, until the part about renouncing his writings on transubstantiation and other controversies. He renounced his writings all right, but those contrary to the truth which I thought in my heart and written for fear of death, all such bills and papers which I've written or signed with my hand since my degradation. The church erupted. Cranmer shouted over the din, "And as for the Pope, I refuse him as Christ's enemy and Antichrist with all his false doctrine. And as for the sacrament, I believe as I've taught in my book against the Bishop of Winchester." The Bishop of Winchester, Stephen Gardiner, who had died a few months earlier. Before he could go any further, attendees yanked him from the pulpit and pushed him through the streets of Oxford to his awaiting pyre. Tied to the stake, with the flames gathering around him, he said, "Forasmuch as my hand offended, writing contrary to my heart, my hand shall be punished therefore." And he reached towards the fire, saying, "This hand hath offended." His last words were the same as those of the first martyr, Stephen. "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. I see the heavens open and Jesus standing at the right hand of God." Among his ashes laid his heart, unburnt. As for his brother Edmund, our direct ancestor, Thomas had long ago appointed him Archdeacon of Canterbury, where he served both the Protestant cause and engaged in shady land dealings. It's interesting to observe that in a near 700-page biography on Thomas Cranmer, Edmund merits about 5 pages. Thomas's biographer describes Edmund as the, quote, "ideal assistant," unquote, supportive without the ambition to challenge him. With Mary's ascension to the throne, Edmund was removed from office, and he fled to the continent to take care of his brother's children, their families, and Thomas's wife. Nellie traces her roots to Cranmer through her father's mother and then Anna Norton. Anna's parents, Isaac Norton and Martha Page, were second cousins. They had the same great-grandparents, so in a way Nellie's related to Cranmer twice. The tree follows a set of Norton sons to Robert Norton. Robert's a little interesting in his own right. He served in the English army and wrote an important work on cannon ballistics. His father Thomas was first married to Thomas Cranmer's daughter Marjorie. When she died, childless I may add, he married her cousin and Edmund's daughter Alice. Thomas Norton, Cranmer's son-in-law or nephew-in-law, depending on the timing, was a Renaissance man in real time. As a young man, he was a tutor to the Duke of Somerset's children, a lawyer, and a writer. As a committed evangelical, he translated John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion into English. 2 of his poems were published in Tittel's Miscellany, the first anthology of English poetry, including the poem Against Women Either Good or Bad. A man may live thrice Nestor's life, thrice wander out Ulysses' race, yet never find Ulysses' wife, such change has chanced in this case. Less age will fear than Paris had, small pen, if none be small enough, to find good store of Helen's trade, such sap the rote doth yield the bough. For one good wife Ulysses flew, a worthy knot of gentle blood. For one ill wife Greece overthrew, the town of Troy. Sits bad and good, bring mischief, Lord, let be thy will, to keep me free from either ill. Yeah, it's as misogynist as anything we can imagine the 16th century producing. At the same time, we should put it in the broader context of the two women who dominated Norton's evangelical imagination for the rest of his life. Bloody Mary reigned when Norton was in his 20s. She threatened all evangelicals. Essentially, Norton stayed underground until she died. The second woman, the second Mary, was the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, who also threatened to undo the reformist project. Mary was next in line to the throne if Elizabeth didn't manage her succession. Succession was the moral lesson of the play that Norton and a fellow student in the Inner Temple wrote and performed in front of Queen Elizabeth during a Twelfth Night celebration. Their play, The Tragedy of Gorboduc, later retitled Ferrex and Porrex, is an important piece in English literature. It is the first English drama in blank verse and a precursor to Shakespeare. Its plot is simple enough. King Gorboduc doesn't name a successor to his throne, but instead divides his kingdom between his sons Ferrex and Porrex. That ends in disaster, with everybody dead and a foreign power invading England. The king's wise secretary, Eubulus, concludes the play, "Lo here the end of Brutus's royal line, and lo the entry to the woeful wreck and utter ruin of this noble realm. The royal king and eke his sons are slain, no ruler rests within the regal seat. No, no, then Parliament should have been holden, and certain heirs appointed to the crown, to stay their title of established right, and plant the people in obedience, while yet the prince did live, whose name and power by lawful summons and authority might make a parliament to be of force, and might have set the state in quiet stay." History doesn't record what Elizabeth thought of their lecture. Listen to Parliament and settle this question once and for all. We do know that she did not marry the Inner Temple's favorite, Robert Dudley. Secession soon became a more urgent matter when the Queen came down with smallpox. Now a member of Parliament in 1563, Norton was part of the committee to, quote, draw up articles of petition for the Queen's marriage and secession, end quote. 4 years later, Parliament schemed again to push the issue, only to see the Queen displeased enough to dissolve it. Parliament had its reasons to be concerned. There were real-world Catholic threats to replace Elizabeth with Mary, Queen of Scots. In 1569, led in part by a couple of Catholic earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland, northern England erupted in rebellion. Pope Pius V fanned the flames by excommunicating Elizabeth in 1570, calling her a heretic and thereby obliging English Catholics to drop their queen. Unfortunately for the Pope, the official paperwork didn't arrive in England until after the rebellion was put down. A year after that, the Queen's Privy Council uncovered the quixotic Ridolfi plot involving the Duke of Norfolk, the Spanish ambassador, and Mary. All of this added to an environment of hysteria that makes the 20th century Joseph McCarthy hearings look like a children's Easter egg hunt. Norton's early answer to these threats was to author polemical pamphlets and advocate Mary and the Duke's execution in Parliament. Later in the decade, Norton's anti-Catholicism darkened as Jesuit and seminary priests immigrated to England to convert the country back to the Church. Occasionally, Norton was tasked to hunt them and their accomplices. More typically, he was assigned as an interrogator to elicit information and confessions. Interrogations eventually meant torture, including the rack. The prisoner's hands would be tied to one roller and his ankles to another. Each roller would be turned, stretching the muscles until tendons snapped, joints dislocated, and even bones cracked. In 1581, Norton was one of the men that interrogated and tortured the Jesuits Edward Campion and Alexander Bryant, and the seminary priest Ralph Sherwin. One Catholic pamphleteer afterwards wrote of Norton and Bryant, "Whom Master Norton, the rackmaster, if he not be misreported, vaunted in the court to have pulled one good foot longer than ever God made him, and yet in the midst of all he seemed to care nothing, and therefore out of doubt, says he had a devil within him." but whether it be a property to the devil to suffer patiently or to torment other men mercilessly, Master Bryant and Master Norton shall dispute the matter one day. Campion, Bryant, and Sherwin were hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn. Almost 400 years later, Pope Paul IV canonized them as 3 of the 40 martyrs of England and Wales. And did you catch Rackmaster? Rackmaster General became Norton's nickname during his lifetime and how he's known today. Norton complained about it endlessly. He even wrote the chief advisor, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, to defend himself against the sobriquet. Ironically, Cecil cut the Rackmaster parts out of the letter and printed the rest in the pamphlet A Declaration of the Favorable Dealing of Her Majesty's Commissioners. Norton's letter, and thus the pamphlet, were an excellent defense of the government's, and Norton's, torture of the Catholics. What comes around goes around, and in the same year as his dealings with the Jesuits, Norton's, quote, overmuch and undutiful speaking, end quote, led to his own stint in Bloody Tower at the Tower of London. The record isn't clear what he actually said in Parliament that got him in so much trouble with the Queen. Around this time, Elizabeth was considering a proposed marriage to Francis, Duke of Anjou. Probably it had more to do with a general trend within England. A group of reformists were increasingly taking a harder line against any of the Church of England's practices that smacked of popery. They wanted to purify the Church, hence Puritans, and Norton was an enthusiastic supporter. Indeed, he made a name for himself as a minority member of Parliament pushing the Puritan cause. Historians have gone so far as to call Norton's parliamentarian faction a precursor of modern political parties. The Queen's spymaster Sir Francis Walsingham got Norton's release and helped rehabilitate him in the eyes of officialdom. After a stay at Bloody Tower, Walsingham even re-employed Norton when Francis Throckmorton was arrested as part of another plot to overthrow Elizabeth. Under torture, Throckmorton confessed and named co-conspirators. Even so, Norton's imprisonment took a terrible toll on his health, and in 1584 he succumbed. Shortly after his death, Elizabeth's court correspondent sent a letter to the Earl of Rutland. I forgot in my last to report these good words, which it pleased her Majesty to bestow upon Norton Sunday last, by the which, with great and vehement protestation, her Grace pronounced him a most faithful and loyal servant to her, and such a one as had done many good services, alleging further that howsoever his adversaries did slander or libel against him, it true it was that he never touched any that had not before deserved to be hanged. And that has always been the ultimate defense of torture. They were evidently guilty. Norton's wife Alice outlived him by 17 years, but under the care of their daughter. Like Norton, she also hated Catholics, but the mania warped her mind. She went insane. Some even say that she was institutionalized for a time at the notorious psychiatric hospital Bethlehem Royal, from where we get the English word bedlam. Around the time Alice would have stayed there, an official investigation declared the hospital, quote, not fit for any man's to dwell in, which was left by the keeper, for that is so loathsomely, filthily kept, end quote. Whether she was ever there, Alice was with her daughter when she died in 1601. Almost 2 decades after Norton died, the English crown passed to James I. James was born to the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, but was taken from her as a baby and raised Protestant. Although Catholic schemes to overthrow James continued in the early part of his reign, the most dangerous of which was the Gunpowder Plot, tensions with the Catholics no longer drive our story. Instead, the dynamic flips to the other side, as the evangelicals saw their dream of a return to the simpler, first-century church thwarted. They viewed the English Reformation as simply replacing the head of the church, possessed of the keys to heaven, with one holding the keys to the armory. In 1604, these evangelicals pressed James with their millenary petition, which protested a number of practices of the English church that they considered Catholic and hence superstitious. such as signing the cross at baptism, exchanging rings during a marriage ceremony, and the requirement that the clergy wear vestments. Again with the vestments. At a conference at Hampton Court, James acceded to a few minor concessions and agreed to support a new authorized translation of the Bible, which came to be known as the King James Bible. At the same time, he let everyone know where he stood. He saw the status of the church as a major pillar supporting his pet theory of the divine right of kings, declaring no bishop, no king. And when a Puritan representative's use of a single word at the conference reminded James of all his problems with the Presbyterians in Scotland, James spat out, "I will make them conform themselves or harry them out of the land." James really didn't harry them out of the land, but at the same time the English church was not going to change. And while most of the evangelicals could accept the conformity among, quote, things indifferent, end quote, there were those who viewed even minor issues as a matter of conscience. They saw no hope of reform and instead advocated leaving the church. In 1607, a group of these separatists, centered around Scrooby, escaped to the Netherlands, first to Amsterdam and then Leiden. The Netherlands was a Protestant nation and, more importantly, a tolerant country, so these separatists could freely practice their religion. The downside of living in a tolerant country, however, is that the children come to appreciate their relative freedom, or at least come to understand that there are alternatives to living like their parents.
There are only two things I can't stand in this world. People who are intolerant of other people's cultures, and the Dutch.
Afraid that their children were becoming Dutch, a group of these separatists sold their homes and resolved to move to the New World. A series of misadventures ensued. The agent of the financiers of the project seemed more bent on squeezing the separatists than provisioning them. The master of the second boat, the Speedwell, conned them out of its title by overmasting it, thereby causing leaks and convincing them it was simply better to sell it off. And when they packed themselves onto just one boat, the lack of wind kept them in port until the point where they really should have waited for spring. They left anyway. En route, a strong westerly gale made for slow progress, and in the middle of the ocean a rogue wave crashed into them, snapping a structural timber. Luckily, the Pilgrims had brought a screwjack, which they used to lift a heavy replacement beam to allow the voyage to continue. All of this pushed the Mayflower far north of her intended destination. When they sighted the outer arm of Massachusetts, they headed south, but when the ship hit dangerous waters of riptides and shoals, the captain figured enough is enough and turned the ship around. Cape Cod it would be. And in November 1620, they anchored in Provincetown Harbor. Now don't let this little bit of irony pass by. The Pilgrims held a patent that allowed them to settle in Virginia, specifically near the mouth of the Hudson River near present-day New York City. Back then, it was Virginia territory. Cape Cod was north of that line of jurisdiction. That makes the Pilgrims America's first undocumented immigrants. Besides funny, this was a real issue. Some of the non-Pilgrims on the voyage were wary of the now sketchy nature of the project. Some agreement had to be reached on how they would rule themselves. Anchored in Provincetown Harbor in late 1620, the Mayflower passengers, including Thomas Rogers, Nellie's ninth great-grandfather, hammered out and signed their governing agreement. 182 years later, John Quincy Adams would describe the Mayflower Compact as, quote, the only instance in human history of that positive original social compact, unquote, about which political philosophers like Locke and Rousseau would theorize. After a month of exploring and stealing corn, the Pilgrims discovered a more promising place to settle across the Cape, which had a good harbor and fresh water. As the myth goes, in December 1620, they stepped ashore at Plymouth Rock. The first winter in Plymouth was hard. It was cold. There was little food, as they arrived way too late to plant crops. Disease was rampant. They would prop up their sick as sentries to fool the natives. Half of them died that first winter, including Thomas Rogers. Those alive buried their dead furtively so as not to let the natives know of their diminished strength. Even so, they managed to stick together, survive that first winter, have that Thanksgiving feast, and eventually grow and spread out. When Thomas Rogers died, Governor Bradford took in his son Joseph. Joseph married Hannah, raised a family, and eventually moved to Eastham, back on the Cape. Joseph Rogers is connected to Nellie on her mother's side. A whole node of that tree, highlighted in orange, resided in Eastham, Massachusetts in the 1600s and early 1700s. Meanwhile, in England, relations between the evangelical Protestants and the English authorities deteriorated. 5 years after the Mayflower arrived in Massachusetts, James I died, and his son Charles I assumed the throne. Charles wasn't Catholic, but his wife Henrietta Maria of France was. More importantly, the king aggressively supported the conservative wing of the church, and the Calvinist Puritans could see that their religious life was threatened, especially after Charles dissolved Parliament and instituted personal rule. In 1630, about 700 to 1,000 Puritans and a fleet of 11 ships under the organization of John Winthrop left England. They established the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where they founded Boston, Newtown, later renamed Cambridge, and Roxbury. These passengers included a number of ancestors: Robert Parker, Thomas French and Susan Riddlesdale, and their son John French, and his wife Freedom Kingsley, John Johnson and Mary Heath, and their son Isaac Johnson and his wife Elizabeth Porter, and Ruth Musell. Eventually 20,000 some Puritans, including a number of other ancestors, would leave England for America before 1640, a period known as the Great Migration. Another group of dissidents moved to Massachusetts with Ezekiel Rogers in 1638 to found the town of Rowley, Massachusetts. 21 years before their emigration, in order to settle a dispute in Lancashire between Catholics and evangelicals about play on the Sabbath, James I had issued the Book of Sports. Evangelicals thought of the Sabbath as a time only for religious study and church services. Catholics traditionally play games after church. The next year, James extended the proclamation to apply to the whole country. At the time, it didn't create much of a stir. According to the book, acceptable activities included archery, dancing, setting up maypoles and other May games, leaping, vaulting, or any other such harmless recreation, Morris dancing, and Whitsun ale. Also, it was fine for women to decorate their churches with rushes. Prohibited activities, however, were bear and bull baitings, interludes, which are short plays shown between longer plays, and as well as always that game played by the, quote, meaner sort of people, unquote, bowling. Charles I reissued the book in 1633 and ordered that it be read from all of England's pulpits. When Rogers refused, he was suspended from the church. 5 years later, Rogers brought 20 families with him to America on the ship John of London. The John of London also carried in its hold the first printing press in North America, the forerunner of Harvard University Press. Among his congregation were ancestors John and Mary Dresser, Richard and Jane Thurlow, Thomas Tenney and Anne McGill, Francis Parrott and Elizabeth Northend, Maximilian and Anne Jewett, and Richard Wycombe and Anne Markham. And take a moment to let that irony set in. Ancestors braved an early 17th century Atlantic crossing to set up a new community in the North America wilderness because they thought it's sinful to play sports on Sunday. Meanwhile, Bishop Laud, who would later become Archbishop of Canterbury, turned up the heat on English recusants, fancy word for those who refused to attend Anglican Mass. In 1632, John Lothrop, minister of the First Independent Church in Southwark, London, was preaching in a secret conventicle, something he'd done for 8 years after quitting the Anglican Church. Bishop Tomlinson stormed the house, arresting 42 church members, including Lothrop. They were hauled before Laud in the Star Chamber. Laud said to them, "You show yourselves to be unthankful to God, to the King, and to the Church of England. that when God be praised through his majesty's care and ours, that you have preaching in every church, and men have liberty to join in prayer and participation in the sacraments, and have catechizing to enlighten you. You in an unthankful manner cast off all this yoke, and in private unlawfully assemble yourselves together, making rents and divisions in the church. You are unlearned men that seek to make up religion of your own heads. You are desperately heretical. How many women sat cross-legged upon the bed, whilst you sat on one side and preached and prayed most devoutly? Lothrop replied, I keep no evil company. They were not such women. Are you a minister? I am. How are you a minister, and by whom are you qualified? I am a minister of the gospel of Christ, and the Lord hath qualified me. Will you lay your hand upon the book and take your oath? I refuse the oath. Lothrop and fellow church members were jailed, and 3 days later Lothrop was back before the court, saying, I do not know that I have done anything which might cause me justly to be brought before the judgment seat of man, and for this oath I do not know the nature of it. If you will not take the oath, then away with him. I desire that this other passage be remembered, that I dare not take the oath. Members of his church were scattered across various jails in London. A memorial plaque in Barnstable, Massachusetts, says that Lothrop was held in Newgate. Newgate Prison was hell on earth. Its use as a jail dates back to at least 1188. By 1419 it had earned its quote-unquote heinous reputation, and the next 200 years were no improvement. At his hanging, one prisoner related his time spent in the condemned cell as, quote, a most fearful, sad, deplorable place. Hell itself in comparison cannot be such a place, unquote. The world's most famous romancer, Giacomo Casanova, agreed, describing Newgate as, quote, hell such as Dante might have conceived, unquote. Daniel Defoe's Moll Flanders recalled, quote, the hellish noise, the roaring, swearing, and clamor, the stench and nastiness, and all the dreadful crowd of afflicting things joined together to make the place seem an emblem of hell itself and a kind of entrance into it, unquote. Lothrop's congregation lingered in prison for months, some for longer, but by the spring of 1634 all were out but Lothrop. By then his wife, Hannah House, had died, and without parents to care for them, his children were forced to go begging on the streets. That included his son Samuel, who was Nellie's 8th great-grandfather on her mother's side. Church members brought the children to the bishop, and they pleaded with him to release their father. The bishop relented, with the idea that Lothrop would quickly remove to America. Instead he dallied, but with the authorities set to rearrest him, he left on the sailing ship the Griffin in August with his children. Lothrop studied his Bible at night by candlelight, and during a particularly stormy spell, hot wax spilled onto the Bible, burning half-dollar-sized holes through several pages. Before landing, he repaired those pages and filled in the missing text, from memory. Lothrop arrived in Boston and then moved to Scituate, where he was a minister for 5 years. A split developed within the community over the proper form of baptism. Like most ministers, Lothrop thought a sprinkle across the forehead was enough, but many of the congregation was obsessed with the view that a good and full dunking was needed. With grazing land in short supply anyway, Lothrop led a group down the shore and around part of the Cape to found Barnstable. There his congregation built a new meeting house, which still stands today as part of the Sturgis Library. On display at the library is the Bible that Lothrop prepared while sailing on the Griffin. Today, Lothrop is most famous, along with Roger Williams, of being an early proponent of freedom of religion and the separation of church and state. More traditional congregations also came under pressure in England. The Reverend Thomas Hooker, who delivered, quote, fervent evangelical addresses, unquote, was forced from his pulpit in Chelmsford. When called by the Court of High Commission, Hooker fled to Holland for a time before moving to Newtown, now Cambridge, Massachusetts, to join with members of his congregation. A couple years later, Hooker and his congregation trekked 100 miles through swamps and over mountains, driving 160 head of cattle through the wilderness. Why Hooker left so soon after arriving in Massachusetts has been a source of conjecture, though it seems to involve political and theological differences with the Reverend John Cotton of Boston, perhaps jealousy as well. About a month later, the migrants reached the area that would become Hartford, Connecticut. The company included a number of ancestors: John White and Mary Leavitt, William Pratt and Elizabeth Clark, William Hyde, Zachariah Field, John Bronson, and Francis Hills. On the same voyage that brought John Lothrop to Massachusetts came Anne Hutchinson. The resulting antinomian or free grace controversy was the first real crisis faced by the colony. But since Nellie's ancestors only play supporting roles, we'll just sketch the history. Hutchinson came to America to follow her beloved minister John Cotton, one of two ministers of the First Church of Boston. In Hutchinson's eyes, only Cotton and her brother-in-law, John Wheelwright, preached the correct theology that people could be saved only through God's grace. Others stressed obedience to God's laws. To strict predestinationists like Hutchinson, those ministers preached a covenant of works. Things started out fine for Anne, as Boston's more traditional minister, John Wilson, had left for England to attend to some business. Wilson, by the way, is Elizabeth Wilson's brother, and Elizabeth is Nellie's seventh great-grandmother. Hutchinson organized a Bible study group to discuss the week's preaching, and soon her house was overflowing with followers. But when Wilson returned, the discord started. Discord became dissension as Boston even refused to participate in the war with the Pequot Indians because Wilson was appointed minister to its troops. To bring people together, the authorities called for a day of fasting, but things went to pot when Reverend Wheelwright preached a sermon that somewhere between metaphorically and actually called for a rebellion against those who preached a covenant of works. The authorities convicted Wheelwright of sedition, but did not sentence him at that time. The Hutchinson-Wheelwright faction in Boston petitioned the court to overturn the decision, and dissension risked becoming insurgency. Cutting to the chase, John Winthrop regained political control in May 1637. By November, Wheelwright was exiled to New Hampshire, and Hutchinson faced charges. A couple of magistrates of the General Court trying Hutchinson were indirect ancestors. Israel Stoughton appears twice in the tree under Ruth Ann Fales, Nellie's mother's mother. Israel was brother to Elizabeth Stoughton, Nellie's ninth great-grandmother, and brother to Thomas Stoughton, who we think but aren't sure is Nellie's ninth great-grandfather. In addition, Roxbury's minister Thomas Weld was brother to Joseph Weld, Nellie's seventh great-grandfather on her father's mother's side. Despite the political forces stacked against her, Hutchinson more than held her own in court. Indeed, it looked like the government's case was falling apart when Hutchinson rose to speak. In fact, it's like one of those Law and Order episodes where 3 minutes before the top of the hour, something crazy has to happen to wrap up the case. Hutchinson told the court that her faith and understanding came straight from God. He spoke to her directly. The age of miracles was over, so her claim was heresy. To further throw gas on the fire, she told the court, quote, "And if you go on in this course you began, you will bring a curse upon you and your posterity, and the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it," unquote. And that was that. At the end of the trial, Anne asked to where she would be banished. Winthrop replied, quote, "Say no more. The court knows wherefore and is satisfied," unquote. Winthrop then moved against her allies, bringing them to court, but also ordering Nellie's eighth great-grandfather, John Johnson, to disarm Hutchinson's faction, going door to door to collect their guns and powder. I guess the tradition of gun control in America is older than the Second Amendment. Meanwhile, it was too late in the year to send Hutchinson away. She was held over the winter under house arrest at the home of the aforementioned Joseph Weld. After her church trial and excommunication in the spring, she is banished to Rhode Island. Due in part to the active efforts of the Weld brothers, Hutchinson feared that Massachusetts was going to annex Rhode Island, and so she removed to present-day Bronx, New York. She and her family were killed there by Native Americans during Kieft's War. 344 years later, Governor Michael Dukakis pardoned Hutchinson and revoked her banishment. Her statue now stands in front of the state capitol. I don't know if you believe in curses, omens, or karma, but both Johnson and Weld may have paid for their involvement in the Hutchinson affair. 7 years after the trial, Johnson's Roxbury house was destroyed in a fire. Winthrop recorded in his diary that it was a special providence of God that prevented those neighbors who ran in to help from being hurt when they came to realize that the burning house was packed with the colony's gunpowder. Moments after escaping, the house blew to pieces, with parts of his home landing 2 miles away in Boston. 3 years after Hutchinson died, Joseph Weld, whose land became part of Harvard's Arnold Arboretum, succumbed to cancer of the tongue and jaw. Just before his death, his last child, who continues our line, was born. He and his wife Barbara named her Mara, the name signifying bitter, which comes from the book of Ruth. And she said unto them, Call me not Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me. At its heart, the antinomian controversy shows that the New England way was always going to be a problem for new, growing generations. Only full, male church members could vote or hold office. But to be a member of the church, one had to pass a rigorous spiritual examination to test whether the applicant was part of God's elect, the so-called saints. Hence, political power was limited to a relatively small elite. Religion and civil rule were intertwined with church ministers wielding significant power, and the ability to change ministers was limited to that same small elite. There were always going to be issues. When Hartford's Reverend Hooker died, leadership passed to his right-hand man, the Reverend Samuel Stone. A few years later, a disagreement over choosing a pastor developed between Stone and William Goodwin, the brother-in-law of our John White. That simple difference bloomed into a complex conflict over church governance and the rights of the minority, as well as a power play between two headstrong faction leaders. Eventually, Goodwin and his company, including John White and Mary Leavitt, moved north in 1659 to found the town of Hadley, Massachusetts. Around the same time, Zachariah Field left for Northampton, but soon removed along with 24 or so other settlers to found the upriver town of Hatfield. While Hartford was still embroiled in its power conflict, the baptismal question moved into the open. If the children of the original settlers couldn't testify to their personal conversion, they couldn't join the church. And if they weren't church members, their kids couldn't be baptized. Hartford and Massachusetts Bay ministers met in 1657 and delivered the solution the general public wanted. In what has become known as the Halfway Covenant, the Assembly reported out a proposal to allow those adults who accepted the covenant of the church with God and were otherwise pious to have voting rights and for their children to be baptized, with the hope that they would eventually work towards conversion and full membership. Some churches changed right away. The liberalized rules didn't become official New England policy until they were ratified in the 1662 Synod. Not everyone was happy with the Halfway Covenant, however. Abraham Pearson saw it as a dilution of the purity of the church, and in 1666 he moved his Connecticut congregation southwest to found Newark, New Jersey. Among these conservative dissidents who followed were our John Catlin and Mary Baldwin. In retrospect, New England's religious turmoil looks quaint. With the tragic exception of a handful of Quakers, such as Mary Dyer, who around 1660 were hanged for their beliefs, religious violence in Puritan North America was light. Back in England, people were habitually killed. King Charles I had earned the enmity of English Protestants by marrying a French Catholic princess and pushing the church away from evangelism. By 1640, Charles had made a hash of dealings with Scotland, who occupied northern England and demanded protection money for moving south. The king's finances became so desperate he was forced to do the one thing he didn't want to, call Parliament into session. They took the opportunity to start addressing their long list of grievances, and relations between Parliament and the king spiraled downward. By 1642, Charles awoke to the danger in London, fled northwest, and the Civil War was on. While passing through Shrewsbury, Charles knighted Thomas Scriven, who became a governor of nearby Whitchurch. A year later, Scriven raised a small force of foot soldiers in time to join with Lord Capel. Capel marched 4,000 men from Shrewsbury towards Nantwich. Although that attack was thwarted by a nearby garrison, Roundhead leaders hurried towards Nantwich, leaving only 300 foot soldiers at Wem. Capel figured to flip the script and fell back to Whitchurch and then made a dash for Wem. Despite being badly outnumbered, the Roundheads were able to repulse this attack. With his army mauled and many of his best officers dead, wounded, or captured, Capel retreated to Shrewsbury, and that opened up northern Wales to the parliamentarians. Sir Thomas Scriven was one of those casualties. A few months later he died from his wounds and was buried at St. Mary St. Andrew Church in Shropshire. It's ironic that despite all of her Puritan ancestors, the only involvement in the English Civil War was on the Royalists' side. The battles in Cheshire and Shropshire ended up being only a minor footnote in the history of the First Civil War. 2 years later, the Cavaliers were roundly defeated at Naseby. The war dragged on for a little while longer, though by then the result was already assured. While effectively under house arrest, Charles managed to convince the Irish and Scots to support a second civil war. The Royalists, however, saw little success, and the war lasted just a year. Charles was brought to London, tried, found guilty of high treason and other high crimes, and in January 1649 was executed. Having defeated the Royalist forces a second time, Oliver Cromwell sent his new model army to brutally conquer Ireland. The full story of the politics is more involved, but it's clear that Cromwell hated Catholics, and Irish Catholics in particular, due to their support of Charles. Under the 1652 Act for the Settlement of Ireland, the English began an ethnic cleansing campaign to clear much of the country of English settlers, executing rebels and priests, sending Catholic Confederate supporters to the Western Hemisphere as indentured servants, and the rest west of the River Shannon. At some level, the English sanctioned kidnapping adolescents to sell them into servitude as well. One of these child victims was Nellie's sixth great-grandfather, Philip Welch. We'll let the court testimony of one witness describe the scene. With divers others were stolen in Ireland by some of the English soldiers in the night out of their beds and brought to Mr. Dill's ship, where the boat lay ready to receive them, and in the way as they went some others they took with them against their consents, and brought them aboard the said ship, where there were divers others of their countrymen, weeping and crying, because they were stolen from their friends, they all declaring the same, and amongst the rest were these two men, William Downing and Philip Welch, and there they were kept until upon a Lord's Day morning the master set sail. Welch, who was around 14, was kidnapped in 1654 and delivered to Captain Dell of the ship Goodfellow in Kinsale. He was brought to New England and sold as an indentured servant to Samuel Simmons of Ipswich. The story is known to us today because Welch and Downing were taken to court. One day they threw down their tools, and while they were willing to work for pay, they were done being servants. Simmons' wife, Martha Reed, seemed to sympathize, shushing a family member and declaring, "Let them alone. Now they are speaking, let them speak their own minds." Simmons, however, would have none of it, calling in the constable to have the two arrested. Welch began to waver, offering to stay on if he were given the same food as Simmons' children. Even the constable thought that was a good deal, but Simmons was in no mood to negotiate. He took them to court. A contract is a contract. The jury ruled that they should be freed if the sale was illegal, but if it was valid, the two should have to serve 2 more years. Simmons was too connected to lose that finding. He would later become deputy governor of the colony. Even so, after his 2 additional years, Welch was released, married, and raised a family. There are 2 bits of surprises in the family tree, all connected through Nellie's second great-grandfather, Dumer Petit. Simmons' wife, Martha Reed, who died a year after the case, is Nellie's 8th great-grandmother. After her first husband, Daniel Epps, had died, she married Simmons. So Reed and Welch are connected in the family tree. Second, Welch's daughter Hannah married Thomas Scribner, grandson to our other Cromwell enemy, Sir Thomas Scriven. The last of our religious immigrants was a group of Scotch-Irish Presbyterians who settled in New Hampshire early in the 18th century. Fun little fact, they're the ones who first planted potatoes in North America. We first need to blast through some English history to get to their story. Under James I, England had established a policy of settling Protestant Scots in Ulster as a counterweight to the anti-English Catholics of the region. Those settlers survived the massacres of 1641 and benefited from the peace that followed Cromwell's retribution. When Cromwell died, his son took over, but after he proved incompetent at the dictating business, landowners and Parliament restored the monarchy to Charles II. Good Time Charlie reigned for 25 years. Despite producing 12 illegitimate children, he died without a legitimate heir. There's that same succession bugaboo again, and the crown passed to his Catholic brother James II. 3 years into the job, James and Mary had a son, which promised to establish a Catholic dynasty. That was too much for Parliament, who invited James's Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange to accept the crown in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. James fled to France, turning the coup into an abdication. France's Louis XIV saw a chance to stick it to England and goaded James into making a play for Ireland. The Irish Catholics still recognized James as its legitimate king and organized forces to occupy most of the country for him. Only the Ulster town of Derry held out. James, who earlier had landed in Kinsale, surrounded the city. He rode up to Bishop Gate and demanded the town yield to him. Her citizens replied, "No surrender," the rallying cry Northern Ireland nationalists mimicked during the 20th century Troubles. Ancestors David Cargill and Justice McKean left their families at Agadowie and Ballymoney respectively to defend the city. In fact, Cargill's wife, Jeanette Smith, had recently given birth to Annis, who 25 years later would marry McKean after his first wife died. The resulting 105-day siege of Derry was horrific. The town ran low on provisions, and a macabre economy of alternative foodstuffs emerged. A quarter of a fattened dog went for 5 shillings 6 pence. Its head was worth 2.5 shillings. A cat cost 4 shillings 6 pence. A quart of horse blood went for 1 shilling. A mouse could be had for 6 pence. Twice that would buy you a rat, fattened on human flesh. Through the years, someone whose prosperity elicited the envy of his neighbors would be called the Fat Man of Derry. As the story goes at the time, the fat man hid in his cellar, afraid of becoming his neighbor's dinner. At one point during the siege, the Jacobist forces pushed a number of prisoners captured from surrounding towns and farms in front of the city walls, where they'd die of starvation if the town didn't open its gates to let them in. The Derry defenders responded by parading their own prisoners in sight of the Irish-French forces, alongside quickly assembled gallows. Message received. The siege was finally lifted when British ships rammed the boom dam laid across the River Foyle and resupplied the town. Roughly half of the 7,000 soldiers defending Derry had died, with a similar percentage of civilians killed, mostly from starvation. 2 years later, the Jacobist army was defeated, and James lived out the rest of his life in France. Firmly under British rule, the Ulster Presbyterians prospered for a while. McKean at one point distilled whiskey but sold out to Bushmills and became a shipbuilder. But the Scotch-Irish, chafed under the Discriminatory Test Act of 1704, where only members of the official church could hold public office, and only Anglican ministers could conduct weddings and funerals, even though everybody was required to tithe. And when a series of bad harvests pushed down farm incomes at the same time textile revenue was depressed, it was time to leave. Led by the Reverend James McGregor, Ulster families including David Cargill and Jeanette Smith, Justice McKean and Annis Cargill, and Thomas and Martha Steele, packed 3 ships in 1718 and left for America. McGregor and company thought they had prearranged a grant of land, but the Massachusetts governor was having trouble finding an available plot. Some areas demurred having Irish in their midst, even though the party protested they were really Scottish. The group broke up for the winter, with McKean living aboard a ship in Casco Bay as he searched for a suitable plot in Maine, and Cargill and McGregor lived in Dracut, Massachusetts. The next year they found their spot about 20 miles north of Lowell, originally called Nutfield, but renamed a few years later Londonderry, New Hampshire. The families reassembled, and at the top of a hill, among the chestnut, butternut, walnut, and beech trees, McGregor preached his first sermon from Isaiah 32:2. And a man shall be as an hiding place from the wind, and a covert from the tempest, as rivers of water in a dry place, as the shadow of a great rock in a weary land.
Just a poor wayfaring stranger, traveling through this world below. There is no sickness, no toil or danger in that bright land. Clouds, they gather round me, and my path is rough and steep. Beauteous fields arise before me, where God's redeemed.
well met, said I know true love. Well met, said he. I'm just returning from the salt, salt sea, and it's all for the love of thee. Come in, my old true love, and have a seat with me. It's been 3/4 of a long, long year since together we have been. Well, I can't come in or I can't sit down, for I haven't but a moment's time. They say you're married to a house carpenter and your heart will never be mine. Now it's I could have married a king's daughter, dear. I'm sure she'd have married me, but I've forsaken her crowns of gold, and it's all for the love of thee. Now will you forsaken your house carpenter and go along with me? I'll take you where the grass grows green on the banks of the deep blue sea. She picked up her little babe and kisses gave it free. Says, stay right here, my darling little babe, and keep your papa company. Well, he hadn't been on ship but about 2 weeks. I'm sure it was not 3 till his true love began to weep and mourn, and he wept most bitterly. Says, are you weeping for my silver arm of gold? Says, are you weeping for my store? Are you weeping for that house carpenter whose face you'll never see anymore? No, it's I'm not a weeping for your silver or your gold, or neither for your store. I am weeping for my darling little babe whose face I'll never see anymore. Well, he hadn't been on ship but about 3 weeks. I'm sure it was not 4 till he sprung a leak in the bottom of the ship, and it sunk him for to rise no more.